Hello, hello. Sylph Dominic Hawkins coming to you live from Reigning Spirit Dojo on Friday, the 12th of June, 2020. I know because I looked up the calendar before I started filming the video. Otherwise you go back in all the other videos and notice that I have to keep swiping down from the top of the iPad to work out the date. So tonight is the first of the sessions where I've invited those students on the page to, if you want to, you're welcome to now join as an audience. So we've got an awesome audience member today. They can't see you, but wave. We've got another sort of 2 weeks of the current level of restrictions after June 22nd, indoor gyms and yoga centers and places like that are allowed to restart classes, but obviously we're going to have to work out how that's going to work for us. So if you are interested, the Wednesday and Friday nights over the next 2 weeks, right up until I think we start back, I think the first actual class back in gi on the mats will be Wednesday the 24th of June, if I'm visualizing my calendar correctly. So the Wednesdays and Fridays up until then, all of next week, and maybe, I don't even know what the date is after that, possibly the following one. Come on down for the Wednesday and Friday night sessions if you're interested in being part of the audience. The live studio recording sounds better when you put it like that. But tonight we're getting into session number 12 of Hoshinden philosophy and theory. So I will be ploughing forward into that and a topic I want to talk about tonight. If we have a much larger audience next week. Not on the Wednesday, because that's just a set meditation topic that I have, but next Friday, if there's a larger audience, come bring BYO blankets and hot cups of tea, then I'm keen to do a Q&A. So rather than me just presenting a whole topic that I already have planned, I'm happy just to dialogue. And if the students who are here have questions, things they want to find out and ask questions about, then I'm happy to enter into dialogue about that in a question and answer kind of forum. So if you're interested in that, you've got questions that you've always wanted to ask, but always felt a bit embarrassed to do so, or I never gave you an opportunity to ask them because there was never a gap in the conversation, then come on down next Friday. In the meantime though, tonight what we're going to be talking about is going back over concepts of reality that we inherit from previous thinkers and just becoming aware of the levels of our understanding, the ideals, the ideologies. We stand on the shoulders of giants. So really none of that's our own. But we tend to pass them off as if it's our, this is entirely fleshed out by us. And often, without even realizing, we use language, and I'm saying we because I'm including myself and everyone on the planet in this. We use language, we use concepts and metaphors that borrow ideas from things that sometimes are completely contradictory to the actual nature of what we're talking about, or at the very least are irrelevant to the nature of what we're talking about. And this is just following on from this idea we've been having in these sessions. I know the last 2 weeks were the pre-recorded ones, which were awesome. My special guest, my Kundalini Yoga buddy, and my Bujinkan teacher. So previous to that, the last couple of live philosophy session recordings, I was getting into the vibe of discussing the trappings of forming identification as a martial artist. So if you remember a couple of weeks ago, I had a video talking about some of Dr. Glenn Morris's work in his book, I think his third book, Martial Arts Madness. You can still buy it online. And he paints an awesome picture of all these different crazy archetypes. There's like the super love guru teacher and the death warrior tribe Viking teacher. And he just paints these really specific, the secret ninja assassin by night, bricklayer by day teacher, and then he goes into talking about the pitfalls of these, and how it is that you fall into that and perhaps what that looks like manifesting in an individual. So what we're talking about there are the manifestations of archetypes. I'm a big fan of Carl Jung's work, and when you read through Dr. Morris's work, you see that he is as well. Kind of comes out his presentation on the dreamscape and the human mass unconsciousness, and Jung's sort of primary idea was that the human experience itself presents these, whether or not they're blood inherited or perhaps culturally inherited, or as Jung kind of coined, that they were constant floating ideas and understanding in the mass field, like the transhuman field of mass human unconsciousness. So this idea that there's like all the humans on Earth share a kind of shared dreaming state where information is exchanged, and part of the information is exchanged symbolically. So he didn't really go into whether he thought that was something genetic, like as if there was an actual manifestation that was a mental projection of vision that was inherited through genetic presupposition, or whether he didn't really get into that. He didn't say, yes, this is a cellular thing, this is a blah, blah, blah. He just presented it as almost like a metaphor, but the way he presents it is far more real than a metaphor. So the archetypes, this idea that the human race, humans go through stages and cycles, and that we all follow the same pattern. So in the same way that the fullness of the manifestation of the acorn tree exists already in the seed of the acorn, so that when the acorn seed is planted, the end point of the acorn tree is already known. But the environmental factors around the growing of that tree will alter the path towards that sort of infinite potential, or not even, that's the wrong word, towards that ultimate, there you go, an ultimate potential. So if the acorn's planted in a place with maybe less water than it needs, then it will be stunted in its growth, but it's still growing towards something. Like there is a blueprint within the very core of every cell in the acorn seed that is kind of calling forward the acorn plant to grow, to bud, to grow, and explains that's what tells the acorn to grow like an acorn. You don't plant an acorn seed and suddenly get a pear. You don't plant acorn and suddenly get gum trees, because the blueprint that's calling gum trees is very different to the blueprint that's calling acorns. So that kind of concept's easy enough to understand on a, say, maybe like a genetic unfolding level. If you take it to humans, we apply it much more symbolically. We say that there are these archetypes, and if you go back through various cultural, spiritual traditions, you'll find that lots and lots of human cultures present archetypal stories, historical stories of the gods. And a lot of their old ancient history doesn't actually mention specific humans. They're not really interested in Billy Jones, who lived in the year, 7451 BC. If there are stories, like in ancient India in the Raja Empire, if there are stories like that name a specific king, if you look at the stories and how they progress over centuries, the story remains the same, the plot line stays the same, but the king changes. So the name of the king is updated, because maybe the king had decided he was a jealous king, and the king was like, no, the story's about me, and then he died, and 200 years later they still said the story, but they were like, oh, well, it's not about King Mumu anymore, it's actually about King Billy John. So suddenly it's the same story, but it's King Billy John. And so you get these, like, they look like conflicting stories, but really at heart the plots are identical. And a lot of the god stories, a lot of the stories of the great deities and their plight, especially Vikings, like, wow, the stories, the great Ragnarok stories of Odin and Fenrir, those stories are archetypal presentations of the human dilemma, played out in mythical, and I mean like mythos, so that all humans have access to them, because the gods live forever. The gods are infinite, yeah? So Odin is an eternal being, certainly in relationship to the lifespan of a human being. And therefore, I can kind of penetrate the archetypal story of Odin, and I can pull out and understand my own relationship to that. So I can insert, like in some of his stories, I can insert myself into that role. And there's learnings, there's journeys. Think of some of the old Greek deity myths and the old Greek mythos. the stories of Achilles and his downfall, and how it is that Hades became a jealous god and fell out of favor. All these stories that, have you ever noticed the gods in our mythos are very humanly flawed? They're bitter and twisted and angry and cynical and grumpy and rageful, and they get embarrassed, and then they burn a village to the ground, and one of them gets, someone won't pay them homage, so they just cast a flood and kill all of his people. It's like, these aren't godly, these aren't necessarily like, I don't even know what the word is. I want to say enlightened, but it's such a cheesy term. These are like, it's like the gods are all bogans, yeah? The gods are all from like some really just hard-running television sitcom. Constantly at odds with each other in this ridiculous perpetual script. And they're trapped in constantly playing out their archetypal stories. So let's say someone like Loki, you go back like the god of mischief, Viking style, so the Norse gods. And Loki, no matter how many times he grows as an individual throughout the stories, and he grows in his character, he makes the same mistakes. So it's like he's trapped forever. He can never really develop as an individual because he needs to represent that particular facet of the human experience, because that's what his role is as the god of mischief. So it's literal. It's like the mischievousness within us all is represented in the stories of Loki. So you think about someone like let's jump to someone like maybe you guys don't know about Heimdall. Let's go to Hercules. Simple. Everyone's heard of Hercules. This whole idea, it's very similar to the baby Krishna stories in Hindi, and very similar to the baby Jesus stories in our Judeo-Christian culture, where you get the baby who's like the child of the gods. So it's half human, half godly, and is therefore kind of a bridge between worlds. And the purpose, the job of this baby is to initially survive, because you've got this super child of whatever god, and the evil powers that be want this child obliterated. So in each of the stories, was it King Hera sets out against baby Jesus, and I forget the king who sets out to kill baby Krishna, and he ends up having to be swapped with another child who is killed in his place. Fascinating. The Indian stories are way more hardcore than ours. But basically these stories are like, and Hercules, kind of gets cast off. So it's like about his hell doesn't quite drink all of the poison. Same like with Achilles. He's held by the heel and dipped in the great soup of invincibility, but the heel that he was held at is his vulnerable weak spot. There's these stories about these humans who escape being like hunted, and then they grow up, and usually in each of these stories, the baby stories, there's a good 15 to 20 years where it's kind of boring and their children, they grow up on a farm. Anyway, then the really cool stuff happens when they start going out and reclaiming their birthright. And so the birthright's all about the abilities that they have, like the godly abilities as humans, and to be able to temper those into the human experience, even though they're surrounded by people who are abusing them or who are manipulating them. The tests for these individuals are always to present and manifest in the physical, in the human experience, whatever the inherited qualities are of their godly parents, yeah? And then usually they end up sacrificing themselves one way or another. They travel to hell to rescue a lover from Hades. Like these great stories. The Krishna stories are far more funny. I think in the end he ends up marrying 40 or 41. He tricks these 41 women into having to marry him because he sees them all bathing. Some like really funny stories. So what you get is all these different cultures. They have these mythos that are presentations of the human experience, immortalized in these gods who are fixed. And okay, I'm back. So the gods represent qualities. So we have this in Hoshinden. You could effectively, it would be as if I was to write a mythos, like the zodiac mythos, for example, and I was to say, okay, there's 12 gods, there's 12 deities. There's the god of fire, the god of water, the god of earth, the god of lightning, the god of wind, and you can see where I'm going with this. Then what that would look like is that each of those gods, those deities, would be manifest. They'd be represented anthropomorphically as human, realistic characters. They would be human-looking. They would have human experiences. They would talk. They would be able to sense and perceive the world like we can. But their character traits and their archetypes of their character traits, they would play out whatever that quality was. So, for example, like in the imaginary story that I'm making up, the great mythos of Hoshinden. No one's allowed to misquote me on that in the future, by the way. The god of earth would kind of be trapped in this perpetual thing of becoming rigid and stuck in his ways, and there'd be this infinite, eternal battle between the rigidity of the old ways and the windy change of the new generation, and it would just be a battle that would play out forever, because it was never about the god of earth growing as a human being, because he's not a human being. He's a fixed. It's like if I was to pull out one character trait of mine and immortalize it as a person, well, then it can't develop, it can't grow. It can never actually experience itself from a different perspective. So it's just stuck. I just get to be a jerk forever, just on repeat, in this little kind of thing. And no matter what happens, and I learn the very next episode, I have the same character play again, And you see that if you look at things like movies and television we were talking before. The characters that are written, not the actors, but the characters and the roles that are written, they're archetypal roles. They're telling stories about the human experience. And so the characters aren't really allowed to grow up that much, because if they did, it would upset the balance of all the other character roles. And then maybe they could grow and develop and change, but then the scriptwriter would bring in a new person to play the same crappy role that was just, replaced. And you wouldn't have them developing necessarily, the whole mass of the culture in Home and Away wouldn't all enlighten together. It would be like they would swap roles so that there'd always be someone fulfilling whatever the archetypal reflections were that the scriptwriter wanted to present. And it's all about presenting a story. It's modern storytelling. That's what television and film is, yeah. Presenting a story so that people can watch it and learn from the mistakes or gain insight. If you think about some of the deity stories, they're like, right, I've read that story and there's this incredible clash and I can see where that character went wrong. I can understand that what the issue was, what that character's problem was, and they were blind to it. How didn't they see it the whole time? Their issue was that they were so fixated on achieving their goal that and their goal was about, they're going to bring peace to the world, and to do that they accidentally killed everyone in existence. And so the story is it's supposed to be a ridiculous, over-the-top presentation of like, what happens if we take this archetype to its extreme? What happens if we take this to a kind of almost an illogical place? Because even though humans don't necessarily have that power yet to do that, we certainly do in our own lives. Like, I'm sure all of us can relate to, no, I'm being so stubborn that actually I don't care. I'm quite happy for this relationship to end so long as I'm right. Or you're welcome to, you can't fire me, I quit. Even though actually it was just a misunderstanding, but now my pride's hurt, and so screw you, No, I'm not coming back to work for you. It's only been 30 good years of my life. These traps that we fall into, the stories are supposed to help us, give us forewarning of the pitfalls and the traps. They're not supposed to become role models for us to turn into, yeah? You're not meant to read the stories of say like the old Greek stories and be like, Hades was awesome. I'm going to go and emulate Hades. That's great. You know, I'm going to go and I'm just going to cause trouble as far and wide. Or Loki, like, you're not meant to read that and go, oh, that sounds great. I'm going to just start spray painting everyone's doors and become a mischief maker because my role model is now Loki. You know, you've misunderstood the point. So in martial arts, what Dr. Morris was kind of pointing out and presenting in that book, Martial Art Madness, was some of the deities in a way. He deified these archetypes as pitfalls and trappings, and there's heaps. Martial arts is full of them. You know, I can just skim my mind over a whole bunch of martial artists I know, and I can fit them into different categories very, very quickly, and myself included. You know, and a whole bunch of you guys. It's like we all fall into various categories. You know, some of us are playing the Hercules role, and some of us are playing the you know, whimsical, seductress role, and some of us are playing the like ride into battle. You know, it's one that Glenn mentions. It talks about, I forget exactly the term that he uses, but you know, in the military, the people who there's been some terrible trauma in their life, and so they join the military and they just sign up for suicide missions, and they just somehow they keep surviving. Damn! But after like 20 years, they're like, you know, massive risk taker, put their life on the line all the time, no regard for their own personal safety, you know, kind of thing. And those are archetypes. What that person has done is they've accidentally trapped themselves into an archetype. If you're going to develop as a person, if you're going to actually grow as a human, and really the purpose of martial arts is to help you develop as a human being, it's not about becoming less human. It's not about turning into a stone statue. The stone statues are gone, you know, like the stone statues they died 10,000 years ago. And one of my favorite Buddhist writers, Mahayana writers, has cheekily said, the stone statues are like the teachers who died 10,000 years ago, you know, and their teachings died with them. It's like, ouch. You know, if those things haven't really developed, well, they died a long time ago. And there's a quote in the Prophet where he says, most of us, we dwell in houses built by the dead for the living. And it's an interesting idea, you know, and he kind of presents it talking about literal houses, but I still interpret that metaphorically, you know, the houses meaning the structures that we've built around us, the frameworks we've built around us. Look around our society, we've done that exact thing. Like we have an economic system that was developed by people who haven't been involved in the economic system for thousands of years. And yet we fixate on maintaining the continuation of that system. And there's growth along the way, but at some point, we need to be able to think beyond just the framework and the structure that it was. And I don't mean throw out the framework. You don't throw out the story. Like, the worst thing that a culture could do is to eradicate its historical mythos and its cultural mythos. Like, if the Greeks suddenly decided, you know what, actually we've had it with this, and they just wrote out Greek mythology, burned all the books, decided that passed a law that said, no, anyone caught spreading this, you know, propaganda of ancient gods in the sky will be burned at the stake, or much worse, you know, criticized on Instagram. Then what they'll accidentally do but not realize it, and this is what our culture has done over the last 50 to 60 years, by throwing the baby out with the bathwater, by writing off our Judeo-Christian cultural history. You accidentally cast the members of the society adrift from stories about human development that they can relate to and see the pitfalls. And then you end up accidentally basically condemning your society to having to repeat the patterns and the mistakes of the past so that they can rebuild an entirely new mythos with new characters of new stories of what not to do because it sucks when you do it. But all that's already there, you know. Like, let's remember how long human culture's been going on for. It's been going on for a freaking long time. They worked this out. And I often maybe come across as like, I'm very strangely conservative in my views on society, not out of like a political stance, but out of literalism. I'm really interested in conserving society. I'm really interested in conserving various stories and activities and practices in society, because I think that it's these stories and it's these little frameworks. It's like coming of age ceremonies, you know, in cultures. How important those ceremonies are and how they're presented differently all around the world. Okay, so we're back. The different cultures have different stories, different rituals, different ways of doing it. They all have different gods and different archetypes. No, it has to be 6 days naked in a bush with a flaming torch. No, it's 17 days on the mountain under a water. Okay, great, whatever. But they've all worked out very specific ways of effectively initiating the new generation of people into a continuous lineage of knowledge and understanding. And that's pretty much what the human culture is. If we were to just suddenly cut that off if you just go and snip, well then you just get people who are adrift. And well, you haven't eradicated, selfishness and greed and contention or violence. Like, you haven't eradicated those things by doing that, because those are innate archetypal human experiences, part of the human presentation. All that you've done is you've removed the reference material for those individuals to be able to go back and be like, oh wait, there's this story about this person who, I'm not prepared to admit it, but when I read the story, they're behaving a lot like me. Maybe I should review my behavior, because things went really badly for them in the story. And once I read the story, and let's say that where I'm at in my life with that behavior, I kind of was up to like chapter 4. You know, it was all going really well. By the time I got to chapter 17 and their life had just crumbled into misery, it was really helpful to get me to review, maybe now is a time to start mediating my manifestation of that character trait. You know, maybe I could actually consider not being such a douchebag. You know, like, possibly. It didn't go well for them, you know, in that story. But if you remove that reference, then the individuals just roll on like a rolling stone gathering mud, and ultimately they're going to have to learn that for themselves. One of my favorite quotes, I don't remember who said it, but I love it. It said, some people learn from the mistakes of others. The rest of us have to pee on the electric fence for ourselves. And it's one of my favorite, I don't know who coined it, but it's one of my favorite little quotes, because it's funny, you know, like you laugh, but it's also it's like, oh, right, no, I get that. That's a bad idea. How funny that sometimes, in order for someone to have written the book about that, and the book title says, why not to pee on the electric fence? That kind of suggests that someone was there doing that. And if you look at the publication date for the book and it says 800 BC, you're like, whoa, that's cool. How many people got to read that book in the last, 2,800 years since then? And actually maybe avoid the pothole, or mediate their behavior, or cause or change in such a way that they had a different outcome. Their lives didn't crumble into peril. They weren't having to repeat the mistakes of the past. So I'll get back on topic and directly talking about in martial arts. Something I think is really important, martial arts styles and lineages. We were talking about lineages on Wednesday. Lineages that still have attached to them, in the way that you pass forward generationally, the stories and the mythos of the past. Like, it's very important to be aware of who came before you, not even necessarily the individual names so much. Like, I know there's a lot of modern interest in becoming incredibly detailed. Like, I want written history, I want dates, I want photographs. If you could pretty much get, video camera recording of every single thing that's happened in history and the history of humankind, oh good, then I'll be at peace. But that's a very modern approach. It's really only the last couple of 100 years. Prior to that, what you don't get such immense detail and this census taking. What you get are like archetypal stories. And so the names of the people update, like I said, every time the king changed. It was just an archetypal king. Who cared whether it was King James or King Bob or King Simon or King Jennifer? Like, who really cared? What's important is the story, because Bob, Simon, James and Jennifer, they're just humans. They're only going to be repeating and the manifestations of human archetypes and qualities. What we're interested in is not what Simon had for breakfast on the 5th on Shrove Tuesday, 7 AD. What I'm interested in is like, what was the plot line of his experience? What was the story? If I fly back with the perspective, what were the key archetypal qualities? What were the things that he was playing out? And where did he go wrong? So that I can understand and I can learn, and then I can review myself and go, whoops. Better jump off that train right now, because it's not fun being little Nero, or little Caligula, baby Caligula. So one of the things that I think has happened in our Western culture, definitely in Australia, probably in Western cultures all over the world, led by America, is in the push against, and the massive pushback against the Christian Catholic roots of Western society, and like the Logos and those kinds of ideas. Unfortunately, what happened, regardless of your thoughts about that, what happened was, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, the society also disregarded the mythos and the story, the archetypal stories of symbology and legend that were passed down by those cultural practices, and then removed the staged development of individuals, and even though, yes, it might have been happening through like the particular lens or a facet of a particular movement, or these were things that happened in churches, or these were people were baptized in very specific ways. That was just the way that the culture did those. There's no difference between that and the Native American way of doing that. On a fundamental level of what you're trying to do, all that looks different are the details. But what's really going on is how do you hand over to the next generation of a culture who are going to inherit your systems and your resources and your language and all of your inflection and your metaphors and all of your ideologies. How do you hand over to that generation, stories and learning that long after you're gone, they can keep extrapolating understanding from, so that 20 years after you've passed away and your students have gone off doing whatever, and they suddenly find a dilemma in the road of their personal experience, they can go back and review a story that you told them. They can remember an archetypal story. They can go back to a legend, reading about mythos and legend, and maybe they'll find in one of those legends or in those stories, they'll find a reflection of themselves that will assist them at that point in time, because you couldn't possibly have given them. You can't give someone all the knowledge that they will need, because knowledge isn't something you can put in a box and give. All you can provide are opportunities for self-understanding and like greater development of understanding. I mean, you can write all the maths textbooks you want, but unless an individual finds a way of connecting with an understanding of the process, it's irrelevant. It might as well just be, smiley face drawings, 400 pages of smiley faces. It means the same unless someone's found a way of connecting to it. So we're aware of that in some areas, but I think culturally we've forgotten that. We meaning like Westerners in Australia especially. I can't talk for the other countries. So in martial arts, I think one of the things that we're very lucky with is that within the context of modern Australia, for example, it's a very atheist country. And regardless of your thoughts about that, one of the downsides has been that the people have grown up separated from historical mythos and cultural stories of our culture. Yeah, we become inundated with other cultural stories, and then children use the television characters from Home and Away and Baywatch, to learn about the human experience rather than writings of the gods from 3,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. They're doing the exact same thing. They're just using something that's like contorted, yeah, and probably far less thought out, probably as well. It's a big, scheme going on. So in that idea, if what martial arts has been able to do, and it's fascinating, I'm sure maybe I shouldn't say it because if I let the cat out of the bag, it might all unravel. But martial arts and yoga's done this in the West. Meditation groups, they've formed these tiny little microcosms within a generally mythos-less society where families and standard Australians people are very willing to come along and send their children, even pay you to talk mythos with their children and to talk about stories of the past and these incredible the mythological stories of the ninja and the mysticism of the ninja. So it's like the stories of the samurai training in the mountains with Tengu, with like bird-headed demons. Those are mythos. Like those are Japanese. They're mostly Mikyo. They're like Japanese Buddhism, Japanese Mahayana stories, archetypal development stories, and they're all about the trials and tribulations that the individuals go through. How often do you think of those stories that are like, Sana-san was defeated in battle and under such shame, fled to the mountains where he meditated in a cave for 16 years. It's always a really long amount of time. It's never just like a week. And then during an incredible, he was whittling bow from the trees and training with the trees, and then training with the demon bird Tengu in the forest, and they taught him to study, and then in a great storm he realized that when he saw the lightning crack down and blast open the cave that he was I'm making this up, and blast open the cave that he was seeking shelter in, he realized that really this whole journey has been he's been protecting his vulnerability, and he returns to face his aggressor. Whatever. There's so many of these stories. Think of the story of the 47 Ronin. These awesome, kind of terrifying stories. They're all about character development. Someone comes along, something occurs for them. There's a development process. Usually they reach like a height of arrogance. They fall from grace. They're faced with their own, kind of self-delusion. They have to go through hardship and suffering. And then through that process, they become humbled enough that they humble themselves to allow themselves to be able to gain some perspective. And then it's their own self-understanding that leads them back to a place of being able to cure their own trauma, yeah, or heal their own misrepresentation. And these stories are never... You don't find stories that are like, the samurai who fled to the mountains for 16 years and lived in a self-help group of a really useful combination of counselors who, after a 16-year period, really helped him understand the value of self-worth. They don't appear. It's all these individuals going out, exiled to the desert. How many people in these stories are exiled from their societies? The whole tribe are exiled from Egypt. And you're like, geez, it's like millions of people, hundreds of thousands of people get exiled into a desert. It's not going to go well. And then 40 years, this whole process, and in it, there's self-learning that occurs. So martial arts has this strange way of existing as a little bubble in a society that has, for want of a better term, really disregarded its own cultural mythos and instead inherited very modern mythos. So how obsessed we are with fantasy books and novels, or how obsessed we are with fantasy video games, or movies that are all about the dragons and the kings of old. There's a reason that we're obsessed with those. We're obsessed with them because we see reflected in them archetypal representations of ourselves, and we're thirsty because we lack those already just in our daily cultural experiences. You know, we're not at home having dinner, being kind of lectured Bible stories, or being lectured like stories from the Quran, or being lectured at stories of Krishna and how Krishna, or some fun stories like how Rama was stolen by the demon monkey god, and and Hanuman had to jump over the ocean to save her. It's like, whoa, these stories are cool. They're like movies. So in martial arts, I think if you have a martial arts style that has removed its own philosophy and its own mythos and its own kind of mystical history, well, you've kind of done the same thing. You've just set up like a military training art, but the individuals they're still going to go through. They're still going to experience rage and hate and anger and viciousness and despair and love and pleasure. Still going to go through all these human waves. It's just that there isn't going to be anything in the direct surroundings in your art where they can reach to and be like, oh my God, there's a story about this. Or, I can still remember so many of the stories that Shihan Ed would tell. So Ed Martin, one of the wonderful teachers, one who passed away a couple of years ago, who I probably first met him in like 2001. He used to come to Australia every year. A lot of you guys know. You met Ed. Some of you met Ed. We went to his seminars. He would tell stories. I don't know if some of you who were there who remember some of his stories. Stories like the fish who wants to walk on the land, and the fish sees a master who's walking along the sand, and this master's well known, and the fish goes, "Oh, master," and jumps up, tries to get his attention every day, and eventually one day catches the attention of the master, and the fish says, "Quick, take me as your student, I want to learn." And he's in the water jumping up and down saying this, "I want to learn how to walk on the land and breathe in the air. I want to learn how to get up on my fins and walk around like you and experience newness." And the master thinks it's a really interesting challenge, so he accepts the fish and goes down every day, and at the water's edge works with the fish and helps the fish, and slowly, day by day, the fish can spend more and more time out of water and without suffocating, and it gets to the point where it can just be out of the water permanently, and it comes back with the master to the master's house. And the master lived in Japan. They had very high garden walls at that time, and so the fish lived in the back garden of the master's, like the house. And I can remember this. I can actually visualize. I can really imagine Ed sitting there telling me this story 20 years ago. The fish, the master had lots of students. They'd come, and the fish would say, "Oh, the master's amazing. Look, he taught me, a fish, to breathe and live on the land. Amazing, what a master." And then there was monsoon season. Like I said, the walls in the garden were very high, and one day it flooded, and the whole back garden of the master's house flooded, and it was just water right up to the top of the wall. And the master came home after this, and after the floods had retreated, he found the fish dead in the middle of the garden. The fish had drowned. And the story that the master posed is, it's always fantastic to move forward, and it's fantastic to develop as an individual, but you don't forget where you came from, and you don't throw out the skills of the past. They all have value. You don't move on to something thinking that where you were is wrong. Yeah, it's just new. It's just something other. It's not to be discarded. And those stories, that's a really helpful story. The fish lasts forever. Archetypally. In 10,000 years, they could tell the same story and it would still have the same kind of power. The fish wasn't Prime Minister Keating of this particular time, putting a name to it almost kind of reduces its effectiveness in some way. The fish is just an eternal character. The master doesn't even have a name, it's just the master. The only thing that even locates it is to say, in Japan they had very high-walled gardens at the time, But you can kind of just say it was anywhere in the world, at any epoch of any era, any epoch of human culture, and any human being who's represented by the master, and the fish representing any other life form. Yeah. So that's a story that's you can translate that infinitely. You can transpose that across cultures, across time. That story has been really useful. I've really enjoyed that story. That's helped me over the years when I found that there were some dilemmas, or there were things about almost I thought I'd moved forward, and there was this thing from the past that was there again, and I thought I'd moved on from this, and that story reminds me there isn't moving on from. There's just gathering of, So it's like, oh, maybe there's actually something in my past that is really helpful. Maybe there's something, maybe not all of those character traits were great, but some of them were probably pretty cool. Maybe I shouldn't throw them all out and just completely, reinvent myself on a weekly basis. So those stories have power. I'm really glad that in Hoshinden, we have a lot of those stories, and they've been inherited. So Glenn presented a lot of those stories. We've inherited them from Hoshin Roshu. Bujinkan is rife with these stories. We inherited a lot of them from the Bujinkan schools. And because Bujinkan is so heavily steeped across Taoist schools and Mikyo schools, so effectively Taoism and Buddhism, Bujinkan inherits a whole bunch of mythos and archetypal stories from both Taoism and Buddhism, Mahayana specifically, which are huge. There's volumes. There'd be hundreds and hundreds of volumes of books of mythological story. We have, in our own culture, we talk about the zodiac mythos, and this is a really fun one. I'll pose you some homework. So, even though our culture we might have really eradicated for the most part the connection to Judeo-Christian mythology and some of the archetypal development stories from that. For whatever reason, our culture has become really obsessed over the last sort of 50, less so now, but 50 or 60 years with old European culture. So suddenly, Celtic groups are back in force, and lots of digging back into old Saxon stories, like the Beowulf story. These really important pre the Enlightenment, Romanticism kind of culture. And I think it's because we find something there that we can relate to, but we're not quite sure what. And so they become kind of on the fringe. Whether or not you decide that you're an astrology, someone interested in astrology or not, or a pseudoscience, or you take it as absolute gospel, and you turn up in your conversation, everyone is like, "What's your name? What star sign are you? What do you do for a job?" And that's the order of questions. Do you actually know what the zodiac mythos? Do you know the story of the zodiac? Do you actually know and we're not talking about the Chinese zodiac. We're talking about the effectively it's like the Saxon zodiac. Do you know the story? The zodiac plot lines? Do you know what the qualities are representing? Do you know what the battles were? Who was in love with who? Why were they chasing Aries? Yeah? Why was it that Taurus was the only survivor of the battle? And those are really good questions to pose to you. And if you don't know the answers, you should probably go and try to find out. Because you might discover that in the stars above us, there are these incredible stories, and ours are kind of mixed in with a lot of Greek astrology. Yeah, so we have a huge amount of Greek constellation mythos that merges in with Saxon, but you can pull it apart, and there are actually zodiac plot lines. There's zodiac stories in the same way that there's stories of Odin. There are stories of Aries, and there are stories of Capricorn. So see if you can hunt them out and have a bit of fun. As we've got a few more minutes left of this, as I wrap all that up, it's been fun. I think I've made my point. As you progress through physical development in martial arts, you're going to experience waves of changing human emotion. If you've found your way into martial arts, and this is just one example, this isn't the quintessential example. If you've found your way into martial arts because of perceived weakness, so if you've been someone who's experienced a lot of bullying, or you felt like you've been on the receiving end of a lot of put down, or you were the smallest in the family and no one would ever share with you, and you were constantly told to shut up and sit in the corner, and you feel you're very shy and very meek, and you let people walk over you. If that's the perspective that you've entered martial arts through, and you tell yourself that you're coming because you really want to learn about confidence and self-defense. Don't kid yourself. You're probably really interested in revenge more than self-defense. And what you call confidence, what you probably mean by confidence is power. So, it's worth at some point reflecting on that. But what you'll find is maybe after a year, somewhere between red belt syndrome and yellow belt syndrome, you will probably become tediously annoying to the people around you. You will be walking around with this, almost like how, I won't give an example. You'll be walking around with this bravado of like, I've swung from the shy, meek one to the absolute jerk because it's like I felt massively disempowered. So in order to do that, I'm just going to flip the hourglass up, and now I'm going to wield power against others, and I'm going to use martial arts to do so. And this is just a way. Everyone who enters from that perspective pretty much goes through that cycle from the people that I have seen go through martial arts, and that the story is directly talking about myself as well. So that's just the way that is. And you enter from different perspectives, you get different cycles. But what martial arts needs to do is build you up in the areas that you're lacking and crush you down in the areas that you're over the top of. Yeah, like it needs to mediate you. It shouldn't just build you up and then leave you out in the world. Because if you're built up from that perspective and you're built up to just being a bit of a prick, and then you're just sent out in the world as a bit of a jerk who now knows how to hurt people and physically manipulate others and lord that over others, well, all you end up doing is you just cycle around and you just swap roles. Now you're just playing out the archetypal, bully jerk at work. So now you just use your own power to leverage over others. Nothing's actually changed. It's just a series of home and away. You've just rotated the characters, but no one's grown in any way. So martial arts should really fill in the holes and really build up the pit holes, yeah? And then usually it does that first, because people run screaming if you just sort of crumble them down at first. No one wants that, yeah? You build up a rapport and you really fill in the blanks, and then when things start really bubbling over the top, martial arts and the art itself should have ways of just crumbling the edges, What's that thing from the prophet? He says, like the fruit tree, I think he says something like, "Oh, love and God." He's talking about saying that love is there both to fertilize you and to prune you. Yeah, it's there for your growth and it's there for your pruning. So like it will help you grow as the tree, and don't make two doubts about it that love will build you up and it will trim you at the edges. Yeah. And those processes are despairing and painful at the best of times. So if we go back to this idea, the stages of martial art, the development, it should really lead individuals to becoming wonderful, powerful, autonomous individuals who are able to just reflect on their own sense of moral standard, even if that flies against the current trend. Because don't make the mistake of thinking that trends and fashions are always correct in their moral application. It's just absolutely not true. Yeah. Look back at the 20th century is a demonstration of how not true that is. It should enable you to be able to wield your power against the actual enemy in the room, who is your own sense of self-inertia and your own inner world. And then make really clear decisions about how you want to be and the sort of person you want to become and what kind of world you want to contribute towards. And then you mediate your behavior towards that end. If you've decided that, for whatever reason, you've worked out, you love the idea even of a world where people smile to each other down the street and wave at each other and say thanks when you let them in traffic or you hold the door open for them. Well, as soon as you work that out, then in order for you to make any movement at all towards that experience, you have to start being one of the people who demonstrate that. You have to take something that's an ideal and turn it into a value. So your values are the things that you give time and energy to immediately. If you want to know what your values are, just look around your life right now. What do you buy? What do you spend your money on? What do you spend your time on? Who do you spend your time with? Those are your value systems. if there are things that you think are great ideas, but that you don't actually ever put any impetus towards them or money towards them, and you're waiting for, but when I win the lottery or when things are different, those are your ideals, and values and ideals are completely different. And you can take your ideals and you can turn them into values. Shock horror. Through this incredible process. But if you think of that, and that's a very simple little example, you go out and you're like, I really want to live in a world where I want to contribute to a world where people smile and are nice to each other and polite and really genuinely appreciative, and that there's a social cohesion of appreciation. Well, it means that when I'm driving, and I'm merging and someone lets me in, I have to thank them. I have to wave. And when someone holds the door open, I have to thank them. And if I thank them with bitterness and I'm just thanking them because it's the world I want to live in, well, then the world will never come. I have to actually convince myself that I genuinely appreciate the action. And if you're someone who doesn't appreciate the action and you're like, I wish we lived in a better world, but damn the people, but you have to kind of fake your own sense of appreciation because you kind of have a, contorted sense of arrogance. Of course I should be let in. I'm driving a BMW, Well, you're going in different directions. You have to fake it till you make it. And then you really are contributing to the world that you want. If you're a martial artist and you've decided that what power is, what it is that you've discovered that is power over self, yeah? Power over others isn't power, that's just strategy. Power over self is real power. Then what you want to do is you go out and you're like, I love the idea that my children can grow up and walk through society without just inherent violence. I love that idea. It's really relieving to me to consider that my children could grow up where I could be like, they jump on the bus to go to school and they're not really at risk of being shot. That risk is basically zero. That they're not really at risk of the bus driver deciding that he hates them and he's going to drive them off a cliff. The risk of that is really, really zero. I like those ideas. So that means that how am I going to contribute? I have to contribute towards those outcomes. They have to be values, And as a martial artist, it's like, yes, I have the ability to leverage physical power over others, manipulate the system and contort it towards my own personal gain in that way. But if I do, and I have this ideal of this world, I have to choose. I can't have both, I can't walk around and manipulate others and then complain that there's too much bullying in the world. Hence, and then look at the problem, all the anti-bullying systems at the schools don't work. I wonder why. It's because all the adults bully each other into the workforce. Fascinating. Who'd have thought that a system of grown-ups who bully each other couldn't instigate a system of anti-bullying? If you write that on paper, it's the most logical thing in the world, but we get caught up in the drama of it. So one of the most ridiculous things, I think, is how violently we fight against violence and how hateful we push against hate. These things are just ridiculous. Hate doesn't lead towards love. Hate isn't the path to love, yeah, in any culture. And if you're confused about that and you really think that it is, you need to go back and you need to read stories of the last 5,000 years so that you can realize that other people thought as well that maybe violence actually could be a path to peace. Go and read what happened. Go and read about Rome. Yeah. Go and read about, the expansion of an empire to bring peace to the continent. And read about what happened. Read about the suffering. Read about the terrible, the centuries of misery. So that you can be like, maybe the character trait that's playing out has kind of been fleshed out before. And there's probably something else I'd rather do with my life than reinvent the wheel. I don't necessarily like the idea of me, long after I'm dead, becoming a metaphor of what not to do. That would be a shame, I think. I mean, whatever. I'm not going to mind at that time. But, it would be a shame. I can imagine my descendants being like, at school, someone puts their hand up, they're like, I'm actually the, great-great-great-grandson of the guy who did all that stuff. Imagine if Hitler had children and grandchildren. Can you imagine being, Billy Hitler? And you're like, yes. You wouldn't be putting your hand up in class so well. You'd be like, we changed our name when we immigrated. It's Billy Hitler. That would be hard going. Instead, everyone wants to throw their hands up when they're like, oh, you're the descendant of that person who just contributed. Oh, you're Nelson Mandela's great-grandchildren. You're like, yes, such privilege and such pride. Those are the positions. Well, those people way back then in the past, they had to make decisions about the world they wanted to live in, and they had to contribute, and they had to really put their own values on the line of contributing in the way that they wanted to. So I put it out there that one of the things that martial arts should do in general is assist people to become versions of themselves that they actually like. Yeah, a martial art that leads you into becoming a person that you would detest is probably not really worth your time. Yeah, and I'm not saying that it isn't necessarily going to help you win. There's a whole lot of martial arts that'll teach you how to win. There's not a huge, it's not very trendy at the moment studying arts that are more interested in living well or getting on really well with members of the rest of society. What's really popular in the mainstream at the moment are like winning, how to win. And Craig and I had the great chat about this in our conversation, the recorded one a couple of weeks ago. It might have been a section actually that I didn't record afterwards. We're talking about how important the difference is between winning and not losing. Because winning, by the idea of winning in that context, it involves overwhelming or overcoming, or strategically succeeding against others. There has to be a loser in that scenario. Not losing, on the other hand, is quite easy. Not losing just means making good decisions. You don't have to be the biggest, best, fastest, most unbelievable, WFC champion 2020. Not losing means living a good life, a person contributing positively to the world around you. And you've really only got reach to the tiny world around you. How do you contribute positively to that reach? And then those people have reach to them, and so on and so forth, and the degrees of separation. So I will leave it there, a few minutes over time. I'm thoroughly looking forward to seeing you all when we get... look, we're back. Sorry, I paused for a moment. I just wanted to say I wish you all a really good weekend. I'm thoroughly looking forward to seeing you all back in the dojo, and we can be there in person and just have fun. We've still got another week, Wednesday and Friday nights of these sessions. You are now welcome to come in as an audience for the Wednesday night meditation sessions, 8 to 9 p.m, and the Friday night philosophy and theory sessions, 8 to 9 p.m. Once the first class back, the actual class, come dressed in a gi, and we're going to be rolling around and hurling weapons. The first class back will be Wednesday, the 24th of June. So the restrictions lift for gyms and indoor sports and yoga studios on the 22nd of June, which I think is a Monday. And on the Wednesday, the 24th, that's when we'll be back in action. I will put up some notes on the Facebook group about what the timetable is going to look like, how it's going to work, some indications as to how the classes are going to run, and some of the changes afoot in my evil plans and scheming. Have an awesome weekend, lots of love, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye.